Why are summers at the Donniel Hartman Institute so special?
Because that's when Jewish leaders and learners like you and me travel to Jerusalem to wrestle with big ideas and study with Hartman's inspiring faculty.
The Donniel Hartman Institute is a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people.
Our scholars draw on 3,000 years of Jewish wisdom to develop the ideas we need to face today's challenges.
This summer, the pandemic has prevented us from traveling, but it doesn't prevent us from learning together. Welcome.
Join hundreds of Jewish leaders for All Together Now, a month-long celebration of ideas from the Donniel Hartman Institute. From now until July the 23rd, come learn with us in this moment of crisis and opportunity.
Hi, I'm Dan Friedman. I'm the Director of Content and Communications for the Donniel Hartman Institute of North America, and I'm excited to be able to welcome you today to the second episode of a new iEngage podcast that Hartman's putting out. It's called For Heaven's Sake, and what it does is engage the central issues facing Israel and the Jewish world. This is the second of 3 episodes that we're filming specially for participants in our summer program, All Together Now. In the next few minutes, Donniel Hartman, Tal, Becker, and Elana and Hain will be involved in a discussion which will cut for the podcast, but you'll have a chance to watch the whole thing as live here first, with bloopers and everything. But I'll let Tal introduce the episode itself. Enjoy.
Hi, it's July 12th, 2020. I'm Tal Becker, Senior Fellow at the Donniel Hartman Institute here in Jerusalem, and this is For Heaven's Sake, a new podcast by Hartman's iEngage project. On each episode of For Heaven's Sake, Donniel Hartman, president of the Institute, and myself break down a contemporary issue of Israeli life that's central and challenging to both Israel and the Jewish world. And then Elana Hain, director of Hartman's faculty in North America, will explore with us how Jewish classical sources can enrich our understanding of the issue. For Heaven's Sake is not about talking politics or taking sides. It's about trying to articulate the most morally serious versions of all the sides of the argument, whether we agree with them or not, so that we can talk to each other, listen to each other, and strengthen Jewish peoplehood. We will focus on the values and ideas underlying an issue and not on their particular political manifestation. Our aim is to deepen engagement with Israel, to foster greater tolerance and understanding across tribal and political divides, to discover a values consensus wherever possible, and most significantly, to explore what Israel can mean in the life of Jews around the world. So thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. This week, episode 2 of For Heaven's Sake, The Paradox of Power. You know, Donniel, it's great to be with you again. You know, when you listen to the news over the last years, there's like these consistent reports of Israel's bilateral relationships with countries around the world improving, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and even in the Middle East. And when you listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's one big reason for this, and that's Israel's strength, Israel's abilities in things like cyber tech, green tech, intelligence, and security. In other words, we are a powerful country, we're a powerhouse, and that is the metric of our success. It's our ability, it's our strengths that enable us to have both friends and influence our neighbors, but also to improve the welfare of Israel. And yet at the same time, so much of the conversation about Israel isn't about its power, but it's about its morality. It's about whether it's living up to certain standards. When you listen to the debate around the application of sovereignty or annexation, about religious pluralism in Israel, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's as if the metric of whether Israel is doing well or not isn't its power, but its morality. And what we wanted to do today about this idea of the paradox of power is look at the tension between those two things. Power on the one hand, not always associated with morality, but it has a moral component to it. And this idea of Israel, not just the Jewish people returning to the world stage in a state of their own, but also, if you read our Declaration of Independence, living up to some core moral principles and the relationship between those two. So I'd like to begin the conversation, Donniel, about this idea of the paradox of power by asking you, make a moral case for power, make a moral case for Jewish power. I know that might make some people feel uncomfortable, but I feel like we can't let this assumption necessarily that power is by definition something problematic kind of rest without developing this idea.
Fair enough. I love power. I love power, and it's part of the things that I love the most about Israel. And part of what I remember when I made Aliyah as a child, the sense that we could now defend ourselves, or even more, that I was going to become a defender. I all of a sudden have power. I think the whole sovereignty move of the Jewish people and Jewish statehood is to relinquish any ambivalence about power. It's to give up on the notion that I would rather be moral and dead than to be alive.
Moral and powerless, let's say.
Yeah, but moral and correct, moral and suffering. I'd rather be the righteous sufferer on that. I think the decision of Zionism is that we are going to embrace power. And on the one hand, we feel and recognize the core moral legitimacy of that power. But I think part of the claim is that we're going to return to statehood, and we're going to know that sometimes our hands are going to be dirty. And that if you don't want to have your hands dirty, get out of the statehood business. And I think part of our decision is a willingness, yes. And I remember on the most personal level, as a tank commander, you are responsible to give the order fire. What could be more? You put a fire. Now, is it always going to be in the right case? No.
Donniel, why is it okay? Why is it okay to get your hands dirty? Some people say that the thing that made it an imperative is the Holocaust, is the experience of Jewish persecution that kind of ended the discussion about whether we could be moral and powerless, because we, as you said, we want to be moral and live, right? But isn't it a bit more than that? Isn't the idea here that power is itself a force for good when used well? It's itself a moral thing.
I agree with you, but I think that trivializes, as I'm hearing you, I think that trivializes the tension a little bit. Because of course the use of power is morally required, because self-preservation is a moral imperative. Self-preservation is not amoral and it's not immoral, it's a moral responsibility. But the dilemma of sovereignty is to what extent the world of Realpolitik is something that you accept as a feature of your life. It's going to be there. Now, the question then becomes, what are its limits? But I am more frightened. The minute power is always justified under moral terms, then there's never a moral critique, because it's morality versus morality. I would much prefer us recognizing that to be a people, to return to statehood in this neighborhood, we have to inevitably recognize that mistakes are going to be made, that certain decisions are going to be necessary for Realpolitik. They're going to be necessary not merely only in pure life and death dilemmas. When it comes to life and death, life is simple, or morality is simple.
Yeah, but Donniel, before we get to this question of how dirty your hands can get, right? How often do I have to wash my hands, Corona style, when I'm sovereign? I think there is room a little bit more to say something about the moral force of power, precisely because there is a kind of a trend in certain places to see power itself as associated with injustice. and victimhood as associated with justice necessarily. And I think that the case for power, Jewishly speaking, historically speaking, is to say that, there probably isn't a greater argument you could make for power being just than for power being in the hands of the Jewish people from a historical perspective. Obviously, how they use that power is very important. But I would say that kind of, in a way, Israel stands for this idea that power is not a vice, it's a responsibility, right? And it also stands for the flip side of this, which you sometimes do hear, this idea that victimhood is some kind of virtue, right? Now, I think victims deserve our sympathy, but victimhood is not something that sovereignty embraces. Victimhood is something you try to overcome. And I think Israel as an idea actually stands against that notion. And it creates a certain tension with the Jewish story, because the Jewish story has had such a focus, a Jewish tradition has such a focus on what is owed to the victim,
Right.
And here we're kind of pushing against
you.
it.
See, I agree with you, Tal. And, just like they speak about how those who are transnationalists usually function and are living in very stable national entities, those who idealize powerlessness are usually those who have a lot of power and have the right to do so. But what I'm wondering is that I have no doubt, and I think this is morally clear, that the exercise of power and the right of the Jewish people to defend themselves and to use power is a moral imperative. What I'm arguing is that trivial?
Yeah.
And not only is it trivial, I'm asking, is it even destructive? Because if we always associate and give that argument, I don't want to be a victim, especially through the lens of the Holocaust, that means anything that we do through the lens of the Holocaust becomes a moral imperative. And then we have a get out of jail card forever. Like in Israel, the famous statement, nobody's going to teach us ethics. And I very often turn to Israelis, why is no one going to teach you ethics? Why? Because you died in the Holocaust? Auschwitz gives us a get out. Listen, I was in Auschwitz. I'm saying for Auschwitz now, everything. I would rather push the serious discourse, not about the moral legitimacy of self-defense. That I think, I'm with you 100%. And very often you're right, it tends to be belittled, especially when someone is 6,000 to 10,000 miles away and doesn't feel the threats that you're facing. So what happens? So you can have the technical questions of how do you respond when missiles are fired from Gaza? Is it legitimate to defend yourself? Not. And then we would say to somebody, what would you do if someone's firing? But I think part of our challenge is that we're just going too far. We're saying now, because of the Holocaust, Jewish power, it's the most moral thing, and we're fine all the time.
So before we go all the way into the other direction, Donniel, I do want to say something. Yes, okay. It's not just about the Holocaust. We can make the case that power is a moral good. It's a moral necessity even. Before we go to the other way to talk about the restraints, I want to talk about this kind of space in the middle here, which is this question about when you as a state begin to ask yourself what is morally required here in ways that go beyond what is the welfare and safety of your own citizenship. How can I do good for the world? If you ask yourself those bigger questions, aren't you somehow betraying or in tension with that first obligation, right? Imagine if, let's take arms sales, for example, right? So arms sales are a source of big revenue, you could argue, or some other act you do. And then when do these moral calculations actually involve a kind of going against your primary obligation? That's before we move to your other extreme, which is when it becomes this kind of blank check for anything you like.
No, I agree with you. And I think it all depends on the culture within which you live and the core moral principles of your society. How do you define your own self-interest? And I think part of most Western liberal democracies and the Jewish tradition, Christian, and I think Muslim as well, ethics claim us. Who we are, all monotheistic faiths live under the principle that we're not supposed to just love God, we're also supposed to love neighbor. And therefore, how you treat strangers, how you treat others, how you go to war is part of my responsibility to my society. Because how my society acts depends on the ethical principles of my society. So that is that's clear. the question is, and I know I'm pushing this over and again, see, when we look at Jewish sovereignty, like look at your life, my life, Elana's life, we get up in the morning and I have 2 eggs or I have oatmeal. Do I sit there at that moment and say, 1 second, I'm having 2 eggs? Now, obviously, I'm coming according to the Torah that eggs aren't dangerous, so it depends on even for self-preservation, that the problems are carbs, not proteins, but whatever that might be. Do I sit there? Does normal life sit there all the time asking what's my moral imperative? And the question is whether statehood, real statehood, doesn't give you that same right. Now, at the same time, if someone's knocking on your door and he's starving and you're there stuffing the 3rd egg in, there's a moment where you are demanded to transcend. But there's something about the normalcy of sovereignty, just in which the Jewish people are leaving the Beit Midrash. And leaving the Beit Midrash means that moral considerations aren't the only moral considerations. Now, at the same time, once you recognize that, then there's now room to say, okay, you're not doing morality now. You're doing self-interest, as is okay, like every country does.
Self-interest is morality too, though, right?
No, but I'm saying no, Tal. That's where you and I are disagreeing.
Yeah.
It's not morality. Yes. And I'm saying that it's even healthier to recognize that.
It's okay to turn the volume down on that, you're saying.
Right. More than that, because only if you do, could you then activate and say, what are my moral principles? Because if by definition, every war I go to is post-Holocaust moral, then I'm never acting immorally. So I would much rather act out of self-interest, much rather, and then I pause it and say, excuse me, what are your red lines? Because the other way, there are no red lines.
So, Donniel, what you're saying, it's pretty interesting. What you're saying is if I call everything I do moral and I'm constantly kind of defending everything as moral, then at the end of the day, I'm never really having that conversation because I'll justify everything in those terms. Let me acknowledge that in the business of sovereignty, my hands get dirty and I don't always have it on the radar screen all the time. And I'm just in the business of taking care of myself in the real world. And then the discussion about what my limits are becomes more real, right? That's
and then morality actually has a chance. Because let's take the case, and I think this is worthy. I don't know a lot about it, but it's a major issue. Take arms sales. If by definition, every arms sales that I make grows out of my moral imperative to strengthen the state of Israel, then I could sell to whoever I want to sell. There are no limits because every weapon that I sell is an expression of my moral responsibility to self. But if I recognize that arms sales and trade is part of the way that I'm looking after the well-being of my citizens and their normal everyday interests, then I will sit down and say, okay, now who don't I sell arms to? What happens when I know that these arms are going to be sold to somebody who's going to kill children and women? And by the way, it's not just children and women that are immoral here. Men, it's also immoral to kill. Then I could say, how much? Okay, so here it is. Could you live
it's
without
funny
that?
What you're saying, let's get to the limits in a second, but I'm reminded, I always use this line from Natan Sharansky that you don't take the chosen people and put them in the Holy Land and ask them to be normal, right? They have to be special. And what's interesting about what you're saying is that it's precisely the acceptance of being normal that enables you to take seriously when that normalcy is dangerous or when you've crossed some kind of line. And this expectation that you're special all the time is going to end up as this kind of legitimizer or justifier for everything, right?
Yeah, we're not talking about annexation today, but this is also just a lens on the issue. As the lens in it is, if annexation, it's all about morality, then you've taken up all the space. But if you could recognize that I'm annexing maybe because like every country, I like land, or I'm annexing because I believe that the Jewish people were given this land by God, make your claim. And then I could talk to you and say, what about rights of Palestinian people? And then you have to ask yourself, what is their moral demand of you? And then you could begin a moral conversation. I'm afraid
where the
Jewish people have too often, I'm sorry, Tal, yeah.
No, I'm saying, so we're trying to map out different ways in which this kind of tension between power and morality can play out, right? So if I want to kind of help our listeners make some order here. One thing is to talk about power as this moral force for good, necessary for self-preservation, which is a moral good, self-interest is a moral good, and everything is moral. Another thing is to say, well, if I care too much about what's moral, in terms of universalistic terms, this is a point I was making before, then I might actually be doing something immoral in relation to my own citizenry that I have an obligation. And you're now saying a separate position, which is to say, recognize your hand gets dirty. This is normalcy. This is the business of sovereignty. And then you can take more seriously hard edges where that moral reality comes into question. So let's go to those hard edges. Donniel, when is it not okay to get your hands dirty for you? Or for someone who wants to frame it in this way?
This is one of the most difficult questions that I struggle with all the time. Because I know there has to be limits, and I'm constantly frightened that normalcy and status quo will allow me to cross those limits. One of the things that I know is that when I stop defining myself in moral terms, at least I am more open to even thinking morally. So if we go to morality of war, I think there's a really interesting distinction. You go to war, the one theory is once you're at war, if it's a legitimate war, do everything you need to do in order to win. Israeli code of ethics, just like most Western democracies, says no. You could use power, but it has to be proportionate to the danger you face. You have to worry about your own life, but you have to make sure that civilians, innocents, prisoners of war don't get damaged. You have to do everything in your power to avoid those casualties, including endangering your life. I would say that if I would test every country and ask, when is it that morality trumps self-interest? And that both, I want to see that discussion on a political realm, and that's something I've heard and learned from you all over and again. Yeah. I want to hear those questions asked. I want to hear the struggles, and I want to hear sometimes where you are the Abraham to God and stone and saying to your country, will the judge of the whole earth not deal justly? Will your pursuit of your country don't you, or like, have you no shame? Have you no shame? Now, it's right. So innocents are clear, but it's this aspiration of recognizing that I'm supposed to be, as you said, I'm supposed to be a real country, but I'm also supposed to be exceptional. Now, how do we balance that? If there's anything that keeps me up at night, and you know where I see it, Tal? I see how comfortable I am with the status quo in Judea and Samaria. I go to sleep at night. I used to go to movies. I have nice meals. I go and I give a speech. But the bottom line is, we've quieted it. And I'm wondering whether we've quieted that moral conscience because we've anesthetized ourselves with self-moral congratulation. It's that I want to hear that conversation. When there is that conversation, then I trust that a country, at least, we're never going to get it right, but at least you're in the ballgame.
When I was listening to you, a couple of thoughts came to mind. The first is that, what role does this kind of the grand idea of what's hateful unto you, don't do unto others play in this dynamic on the world stage? Because after all, I would expect any other country with power to pursue its self-interest. It's part of the game in a certain sense. But there's a tension because that's not the only question that is operating.
Correct.
I think even in the Zionist story, right? The Zionist story itself is not just about the Jewish people being able to advance the Jewish agenda. Returning to the world stage in and of itself is about our contribution to the world, right? And what the values of the world, how the world operates. And so in a sense, I think in a way we narrow or impoverish the promise of Zionism when we talk about Israel only through the pursuit of self-interest and not actually having morality as a constraint on self-interest, being itself a self-interest, Beautiful. If you know what I mean.
Yes.
Right?
Do you know what another way of saying it would be? How does this sound to you, Tal? And what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others is a good rule of thumb. But very often, the way you're supposed to treat other people is not the way you would want to be treated, but the way they want to be treated. And so between what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. And on the other hand, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Where your standard is not others, is a higher one.
Yeah.
What I want from my Israel, what makes me excited about being a Zionist, is that political discourse has to entail this tension. Now, as long as I feel it, then the President Rivlin, I could disagree with people on so many political consequences.
Yeah, as long as they're grappling.
Do I hear it? Do I hear it?
Yeah.
It's when I don't hear it that it's like, okay, now we're like a nation like all other nations. We've given up on holiness. Yeah. Or what's more dangerous is when we anoint ourselves as moral regardless of what we do. That is the deepest moral danger that any country could ever. That's the precipice that we can cross.
We may have to leave this for another time, but there is a question here about how unique we are to other countries, certain Western countries as well, that put that limit on. I did want to add one extra idea before bringing Elana in to study some text with us. And that is simply that one of the, I think, unique things about Israel is that we do ask a lot of our citizens. We do ask for sacrifice in a serious way. And when you ask for sacrifice, I think self-interest gets you so far, but if you can't attach that sacrifice to a bigger idea, to a bigger aspiration in a meaningful way, I think there's a risk that you kind of wear out the commitment to this project more in general. And so I think it's paradoxical, I guess, but there's a self-interest in being about more than self-interest, right? There's a real value in investing in a society that on the one hand understands that this is normalcy and this is realpolitik and so on, but never disconnects from the question of what is the bigger aspiration. Because then even the pursuit of self-interest, it becomes a little bit easier, as long as you do it honestly. And I think your point about honesty here, and honesty requiring you to kind of allow yourself to be comfortable with a little bit of dirty hands, is a very important one. Elana, help us think about how this idea has been kind of spoken about a little bit in some classic Jewish texts. We'd love to hear it. Thanks for joining.
Absolutely great to be here. One of the things that's coming out of your conversation is actually the fact that power becomes suspect when we're talking about us versus them. And I think that has great resonance within Jewish texts, because when you're powerless, the idea that you have to focus on the us, of course you have to focus on the us. But when you have power, that's where the litigation begins of how much of my power is used to protect, to flourish, to have normalcy for us, and how much of my power is concerned with them. And I want to look at two texts that admittedly are not about statecraft, because we don't have too many rabbinic texts that are about statecraft, right? Two texts, one of which is about the individual, one is about the collective, one where the stakes are so severe and so obviously severe, and the other where the stakes are a little bit more about normalcy, a little bit more about flourishing. So the first text is famous, which basically means I know it, right? The first text is from the Talmud in Bava Metzia, 62a, where we talk about two people traveling on a road. There's only one bottle of water. And of course, there's power in this because one of them owns the bottle and brought it. And if both of them drink, they'll both die. But if one of them drinks, that person will make it to civilization. So we have two approaches here. The son of Petura says, it's better that they both drink and die so that neither one of them sees the death of their fellow, right? Better to die a martyr on the sword of your morality than to actively, and it's not passive, you're drinking, actively use your power to save yourself at the expense of someone else. That was the law until Rabbi Akiva came and taught from Leviticus, your brother's life is with you. He taught that morally, your life takes precedence over the life of your fellow. And here we see dramatized what you guys were talking about as almost the Holocaust thinking, right? Which is when it comes to my self-defense, when it comes to helping my people actually avoid imminent danger, then actually it's a moral idea in Judaism. I understand it comes from the individual and we'd have to extrapolate to the collective. It's a moral idea to save my own, even if it means there's an expense to someone else. That is not a comfortable idea for a lot of people today. It's not a comfortable idea, but it is a Jewish idea where I find
Elana, you really think that that idea is not comfortable? You live in that really that in when life versus life, that even in that case, life versus life, you would argue that it
think it is. I think it is very hard for people to say that out loud and feel that as a moral imperative to say, no, our blood is redder. And it's not that our blood is redder, it's that we have a responsibility to our blood. And
no, it's exactly. It's not our blood is redder.
Correct.
It's not that I am born, but I have a responsibility to it.
Right. If
This
the
is
other
where
guy
it's difficult.
had the water, Elana, if the other guy had the water, he would have drunk it, right? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ben Petora, this is the only time he's mentioned in the Talmud, right? Which
yes, and people actually connect it to sort of a Christian turn the other cheek to Peter and apostles, and that this is actually a real, it's a real polemic actually going on here, where Rabbi Akiva is saying, no, the only way someone can live with you is if you're alive. The only way someone can live with you is if you're alive. There's a responsibility that you have. But I do think that our blood is redder versus we have a responsibility to our own. It's very hard for people to experience the difference between those two. Even as I'm arguing, I believe there is a difference between those two, right? There is a difference. I want to look at the other text so that we can have something to compare it to. The other text is an earlier text, actually, of the same tractate. It's an earlier text that has a different kind of stake. It's not always so clear that it's my life versus your life. There might be something else more, Tal, what you were bringing in as normalcy, right? Or Donniel, self-interest. So we have the case of a spring. This is the Tosefta in Bava Metzia, chapter 11. The case of a spring which belongs to the people of a town. What happens if there is enough water to drink only for the townspeople or for others in another town? So of course the townspeople take precedence in the drinking water over others, right? That's fine. That's Rabbi Akiva. We've seen that before. But now it's going to get a little more difficult. What happens if there's enough water to save the townspeople and their animals, or there's enough water to save the lives of the other people who are not in the town? So it's me and my animals versus other people's lives. That's where we have an argument. The first opinion says the lives of others, of course, take precedence over the animals of the townspeople. What are you even thinking? Humans and animals, what are you even thinking? And then comes Rabbi Yossi, and he says, no, I disagree. The townspeople's animals take precedence over the lives of others. Wow. When you get to this, you ask yourselves, well, we're obviously now talking about pets. We're not talking about, your dog or your cat. We're talking about maybe the animals have to do with economics, right? They plow for you, you travel on them. Maybe they have to do with some sort of safety. If you're going to travel, better to travel by animal, but on foot. But it's definitely not the same. The stakes are not the same as if I don't drink, I'm going to die, and my people drink first. I'm allowing for something more. And the last example is even more intense. What if there is enough water to save others or to do the laundry of the townspeople? Yeah, you're making that face because, Tal, right? So, of course, argument. One says the lives of others takes precedence over the laundry of the townspeople. Of course, I mean, who would ever think otherwise, right? Your 2-egg scenario, Donniel, someone is knocking on the door and they have no eggs. Of course I should give them. What kind of luxury is this? Comes again Rabbi Yossi. He says the laundry of the townspeople come before the lives of others. Now, this is very, very difficult to understand. I think there are two ways to read this. One way to read this is to say, you know what, the laundry, if you don't do the laundry, maybe it's going to be a hygiene problem. Maybe it's going to cause problems in the future, right?
Now, leave that one. Don't make it moral. It's too interesting.
There's another way to read it.
You're trying too hard.
There's another way to read it, which is that's actually the way societies function. If we look at where our money is spent, if we look at where our resources are spent, our resources are not spent on saving everybody's lives around the world. They're spent
you want to know
on our own.
When I'm hearing you talk, it was something came to me, and I think we should probably deal with this together in an upcoming session. When you said, what does a society do? Every society does its own laundry. Every society gives money to roads and to the well-being of its citizens, more than it gives to foreign aid. You're absolutely right. But you know what's interesting? I think there's a different standard when we judge, when we act on our own, or when we're assessing somebody else. And the whole issue of criticism and assessing from far away, it actually, when you're so close, you get used to the smell. You don't even have any sense. Now, the question is whether you have that responsibility or not. But I think you're right. Every country works that way. The question is, and I want to ask you, you brought two sources. I feel claimed by each one of them, and that's why I'm in trouble. Like, if I just did the Tosefta, okay, I'm home free. Israel, do your laundry as much as you can in the Middle East, and plague beyond every. I'm claimed by both of them. And how do you work out, how do you live with both of them, Elana?
Well, look, I think that this text, even this latter text, first of all, it's an argument. It's a machloket. Rabbi Yossi is the lone voice here. He's not the anonymous multitudes.
Majority.
And I think that's really important. There has to be an argument about that. If there's no argument about that, then you've made morality trivial. If there's no argument between those two voices of their lives, our laundry, we have a problem. The other thing is, I think this text presents such an extreme version, which is there's scarcity of one resource, right? And so Rabbi Yossi says, I need that resource, and I'm going to take that resource. I think there's actually a lot more multidimensionality here, right? The question of when you do one thing in one arena, can you do something else in another arena to be able to help those other people? Here, it's so zero sum. It's so zero sum. Yeah. That's not the way life should be, and it's not the way it is.
You know, Elana, what's so striking in the second test, the Tosefta, for me, was how shocking I found the question. I mean, we all find the question, and yet you think about it for a second, as you say, and said, well, that's what we do. So maybe, one of the takeaways from this is simply that, and it may be, Donniel, this pushes against you a little bit. I'd like to hear how you respond to it. Maybe the problem is the normalcy, right? We treat it as normal that we should do our laundry and it takes the precedence. And maybe the issue is, no, I need to think about that. I need my normalcy to be questioned all the time. And so that I have this kind of constant nagging feeling that maybe I'm not doing what I need to do. Donniel, can you tell me if you live comfortably with your normalcy argument in light of what I said?
This is the question that we're asking ourselves when we come back to Israel. I would say all of us, Elana, Tal, myself, we live just fine with doing laundry, and we don't constantly berate ourselves and ask, what did I just spend on food versus what I spent? What, I'm having steak tonight? The reality is we don't do that. But what we don't do on a personal level, on a national level, it gets amplified, because here you see the difference or the connection between your individual policy and on a larger scale where the distortion is much clearer. And even there, I think it's okay. But as I go back to, what are the other voices? And that's why, Elana, the bringing of those two sources are so critical. Because if all we had was the Tosefta and the laundry, no. I love Ben Petura. And remember, in our tradition, we mentioned Ben Petura. We could have wiped him out, just like we did a lot of other Christians. We could have wiped him out. He's only mentioned once. No one would even know. Like, it's not like I had this whole thing. Is when we mention Ben Petura, I want you to be claimed by it. I want you to be, even if you override it, I want you to be claimed by it. There is a place where morality has to challenge you about your laundry. Listen, that's what happens when you have refugees, you always have limited resources. And it definitely even has to challenge you when your life is in danger. every country has to ask itself, when are you willing to endanger yourself for the sake, as Tal, you mentioned, for your deeper sense of self?
I need to say one more thing so that the world does not think that I'm a Rebbe Yossi follower, okay? Even if that's the
Nothing
way I
wrong with
live my life. I want to say the following. What this
You're ambitious
Tosefta,
about the number of podcast followers. I'm happy that the world is listening. Go
even
for
if
the
it's
world.
just my friends, okay? The Tosefta here posits a very clear us and them dichotomy. And I think there's another moral voice that asks us to consider, what if we're all part of the same town? And that, I think, is really complicated, especially when there's deep conflict and violence between the different townspeople. So I want to end with that.
That's a beautiful thought to end this conversation on. You know, Donniel and Elana, when we talk about for heaven's sake and arguments for the sake of heaven, we're really trying to find the degree of discomfort we have by embracing completely one position. And I think in this conversation, it's kind of felt quite powerfully. Yes, you can understand power and self-interest, and in a way, the kind of demands of self-preservation, especially on the Jewish people. Yes, you can understand the commitment to the kind of this broader morality, but in a way, commitment to either of those in a complete sense has its kind of risks and almost failings. In a way, as Donniel and Elana, you were just talking in a minute, I was thinking back to Israel's Declaration of Independence itself, and it has this kind of tension built in it, right? It is about the Jewish people's story, self-preservation, the Holocaust, our connection to the land, our historic, us. And then it has all these higher aspirations that are about the world and who we might be. And
The
when we're
well-being of
normal
all
and
the
when we're not normal.
citizens.
Yes, exactly. And I think that kind of, I don't know whether being comfortable in each of those spaces, I might say being uncomfortable in each of those spaces is something that I think is required of us in a way. So first, just thank you so much for that conversation, and Elana, for those wonderful texts. And thank you all for listening to our show. For heaven's sake is a product of the Shalom Hartman Institute and the iEngage program. This episode was edited by David Zvi Kalman, and our managing producer is Dan Friedman, with music provided by So Called. To learn more about the Shalom Hartman Institute, visit us online at shalomhartman.org. We want to know what you think about the show, so you can write to us at forheavensake@shalomhartman.org. Subscribe to our show in the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, SoundCloud, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Thank you, Donniel and Elana.
Nice being with you. Bye.
Take care.